Good evening. I'm Liam, and this is Liam Analysis. Tonight we're examining one of the most consequential moments in modern diplomatic history, a moment that unfolded not with fanfare or dramatic confrontation, but with the measured precision of a single statement delivered in Brussels that has fundamentally reorganized the Western alliance. What you're about to see is the story of how 9 words, spoken by Canada's Mark Carney, silenced the White House and realigned NATO against the current administration's demands. This is not speculation. This is documented institutional history happening in real time. Let me set the scene for you. Thursday afternoon, NATO headquarters in Brussels. The diplomatic press hall is arranged with the precision these institutions maintain. 31 nations represented. The American Secretary of State is seated in the second row. NATO's Secretary General stands at the side, observing. The live feed carries directly to the White House Situation Room. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, former governor of the Bank of Canada, stands at the lectern. A man whose entire professional life has been spent understanding that the most consequential statements are delivered without theatrical staging. He opens a single folder, looks directly at the camera carrying the feed to Washington, and in the measured cadence of a man reading words he has personally drafted, he delivers 9 words that will be read into parliamentary committees and quoted in every foreign ministry in the alliance. The room registers complete stillness. According to 4 diplomatic correspondents who have since reconstructed the moment, this is what diplomatic history records as the instant a structural assumption is permanently disqualified. To understand why those 9 words carry the weight they do, we need to understand what led to that moment. Over the preceding 11 weeks, the President of the United States had issued a coordinated sequence of bilateral demands to 28 members of NATO. These weren't casual requests. They were structured, systematic, and unprecedented in their scope. The Financial Times described these demands as the most coordinated attempt by any single member to restructure NATO's operating logic since the original ratification of the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949. Let me break down what the United States was demanding. First, Allied governments had to accept bilateral economic agreements containing tariff provisions, energy pricing commitments, and industrial policy review mechanisms. The Canadian Department of Finance quantified this, approximately $340 billion in long-term economic authority being transferred from Allied governments to the American Treasury. Second, Article 5, NATO's collective defense commitment, would be reformulated so that American defense participation would be contingent on accepting those bilateral economic terms first. Third, no multilateral commercial or security arrangements without prior American approval through bilateral consultation. Think about what this means. NATO was being asked to dissolve from a multilateral alliance into a hub-and-spoke bilateral system centered on the United States. The numbers were staggering. $1.7 trillion in annual bilateral trade affected. $1.4 trillion in annual defense expenditure under existing burden-sharing arrangements, 28 bilateral relationships and 43 additional commercial relationships outside NATO would be brought under this framework over 5 years. 3 Allied governments had signed. 4 more were actively negotiating. The remaining 21 were waiting for one head of government to say publicly what their foreign ministries had been concluding privately for weeks. What happened in the 72 hours before the Brussels address is now being reconstructed by reporters at 5 separate publications, and this is where the story becomes remarkable. Carney did not convene public meetings. He did not issue characterizations of the 3 governments that had already signed agreements. He did not react publicly in any form during the 11 days preceding the Brussels ministerial. Instead, according to 4 people familiar with his schedule, he placed sequential calls to 14 NATO heads of government over a 6-day period. Each call lasted between 17 and 31 minutes. In each call, he conducted a substantively identical conversation. He informed each leader that Canada had concluded, after consultation with the Department of Justice and the Department of Global Affairs, that the cumulative effect of the American demands would constitute the operational dissolution of the alliance under the language of the North Atlantic Treaty. He shared the analytical documentation from Canada's Department of Finance, quantifying the long-term costs of the agreements already signed. He informed each leader that Canada intended to address this conclusion publicly at the Brussels briefing, in a statement delivered on his personal authority and not coordinated with any other allied government. And critically, he did not request endorsement. He did not request silence. He informed each leader as a matter of courtesy that he wished them to hear the conclusion from him before they heard it anywhere else. The responses varied only in diplomatic register. The Secretary-General of NATO listened for 23 minutes and replied that NATO would not interpose any institutional objection. The UK Prime Minister replied that the United Kingdom would attend the briefing. France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, Poland, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Finland all indicated the analytical conclusion was consistent with their own assessments. None attempted to dissuade him. None requested modifications. And critically, none informed the United States that these calls had occurred. Thursday afternoon. Carney delivers his address. 4 minutes and 41 seconds. It is structured with the precision of a man who spent 40 years writing central bank communications that could not afford to be misunderstood. He acknowledges the gravity of the moment in a single sentence. He confirms for the public record that the alliance is being asked through coordinated bilateral demands to accept an operational restructuring that would dissolve its multilateral character into a bilateral hub-and-spoke arrangement. He summarizes the demands by category. He presents the quantitative scale of the economic and security costs. He names the 3 governments that have already signed and notes, without characterization, that they made sovereign decisions under conditions of significant economic pressure. Then he pauses. He looks directly at the camera carrying the feed to the White House Situation Room, and he delivers the 9 words. The alliance is not the property of any single member. He repeats the phrase. He lets it settle. On the surface, those 9 words mean exactly what they say. NATO was founded in 1949 by 12 sovereign governments on the explicit principle that security and prosperity would be determined by collective decisions of members, not the unilateral preferences of any single member, however large or however central. The demands being directed at 28 of 30 NATO members by the 31st member are inconsistent with that founding principle. Canada would not accept those demands. Canada would not sign bilateral agreements. Canada would not accept the reformulation of Article 5. Canada would not accept the multilateral pre-approval framework. But beneath that surface meaning lies something deeper. For 76 years, NATO has operated on a foundational assumption that no member had ever previously been required to articulate publicly. That the alliance is a shared institution, not a possession. The demands had publicly disqualified that assumption. The disqualification had been observed by every foreign ministry. It had been incorporated into every analytical assessment, and now it was being addressed on NATO's most consequential public platform by the head of government of one of the founding members in explicit language of the North Atlantic Treaty itself. Carney closes the folder, nods to the Secretary-General, leaves the lectern without taking a single question. What happened in the hours that followed is the story that every strategic analyst is now studying. Within 90 minutes, the United Kingdom issues a statement aligning with Canada's analytical conclusion. Within 2 hours, France issues an equivalent statement. Within 3 hours, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden each issue substantively equivalent statements. By the end of the day, 14 NATO heads of government have publicly aligned themselves with Carney's analytical conclusion. By the end of the following day, that figure grows to 21. Think about that number. 21 out of 30 NATO members. 70% of the alliance has just publicly committed to rejecting the demands of the most powerful member. The financial markets understood the structural significance immediately. Within 72 hours, the Canadian dollar strengthened 3.1% against the US dollar. The euro strengthened 2.4%. The British pound strengthened 2.1%. The S&P 500 declined 3.7% across 4 trading sessions. the combined market capitalization of the 7 largest American defense contractors declined by $74 billion. Goldman Sachs issued a client communication that captured the institutional assessment in a single sentence. The institutional realignment articulated in the Brussels press hall has been confirmed in the responses of 21 allied heads of government within 48 hours and will materially constrain the operational scope of American commercial and security diplomacy across the alliance for the remainder of the current administration. The Business Roundtable, whose membership includes the CEOs of the 11 largest American defense and industrial firms with concentrated allied operations, called for immediate restructuring of American bilateral negotiating frameworks and a return to multilateral institutional channels. The National Association of Manufacturers stated that the demands imposed reputational costs on American industrial diplomacy that no corrective action could fully recover. The institutional fracture extended into American domestic politics. The governor of Virginia, whose state houses the largest concentration of American defense industrial employment, stated that 127,000 of his constituents work in industries directly exposed to the affected commercial and security relationships. Those constituents, he said, deserve a federal government that understands the operational consequences of attempting to convert multilateral institutions into bilateral instruments. The governor of California stated that the state's manufacturing exports to allied economies have been negotiated under the assumption of multilateral institutional frameworks. That assumption, she said, can no longer be relied upon under the current administration. The governor of Connecticut stated that the defense industrial base depends on integrated transatlantic supply chains and that the bilateral demands have introduced operational uncertainty no employer can absorb. A Republican senator from Maine, whose constituents have served alongside allied forces for generations, said the institutional realignment revealed a fracture in the alliance that no political characterization could be permitted to obscure. A major news organization's poll conducted within 5 days of Brussels found 67% of Americans, including 42% of Republicans, found Carney's conclusion measured and persuasive. 73% of independent voters believed the administration had fundamentally misunderstood the institutional consequences of its demands. The realignment extended beyond NATO. 7 additional governments outside the alliance requested briefings from the Canadian Foreign Ministry on the analytical framework articulated in Brussels. 4 sovereign wealth funds initiated formal reviews of their American asset allocations. The European Central Bank circulated an internal memorandum recommending that future commitments involving the United States be reviewed in light of the publicly documented institutional realignment. Let me share the analysis that has been read into the record of 3 congressional committees and reprinted on the editorial pages of every major financial publication in North America. Warren Buffett, observing from Omaha, where Berkshire Hathaway holds substantial exposure across the defense, energy, and industrial sectors most directly affected, offered the defining structural insight. In 70 years of observing the relationship between institutional design and member behavior, I have identified one principle that applies without exception to every multilateral institution I have ever studied. The functioning of any multilateral institution depends on the continued willingness of its most powerful member to operate within the institutional framework, rather than to attempt to convert the institution into an instrument of that member's bilateral preferences. The willingness is the institution. The institution does not exist independently of the willingness. Buffett continued, "The moment the most powerful member publicly disqualifies the willingness, the institution faces a binary choice. It can accept conversion and dissolve into the bilateral arrangement preferred by the most powerful member, or it can reject the conversion and continue to function as a multilateral institution on the basis of the collective decisions of its remaining members. There is no third outcome. There is no negotiated middle position. The choice is binary, and the choice is structural." Applying this principle with precision, NATO had been presented with exactly this binary choice. The American demands had publicly disqualified the willingness of the most powerful member to operate within the institutional framework. The alliance had been required to choose. 3 governments chose accommodation. 28 governments had been waiting for one head of government to articulate the alternative choice publicly in language that committed his government to that choice, and provided the analytical framework on which others could base their own commitments. Carney did precisely this. The 9 words had been the structural articulation. The accompanying analysis provided the framework. The Brussels press hall had been the platform. And the responses that accumulated in the hours and days that followed constituted, Buffett concluded, the most consequential institutional realignment in the history of the alliance since the original ratification. Buffett identified the deeper structural insight that every strategic analyst is now examining. The 9 words did not divide the alliance. The 9 words revealed that the alliance had already been divided by the demands of its most powerful member into the governments that would accept conversion and those that would not. The division had existed in foreign ministry assessments for weeks, but it had not been articulated publicly because no head of government had been willing to bear the personal political cost of articulating it. Carney bore the cost. The articulation occurred, and the alliance, from the moment of articulation, had a new operating logic. 28 of its members had publicly committed themselves to the institutional principle the founding member had publicly disqualified. The questions now being asked in every chancery, every defense ministry, and every legislative committee are these. First, can the United States continue to issue bilateral demands of this magnitude after 21 allied heads of government have publicly committed themselves to the institutional principle those demands were intended to disqualify? Second, if it cannot, what does the Brussels Press Hall Address mean for every commercial and security commitment the current American administration has scheduled with any allied government for the remainder of the presidential term? Third, when the alliance has publicly declined to be converted into the property of any single member, and 21 of its heads of government have personally committed to the principle that defines that decline, who is in a position to insist that the conversion proceed? Here is where we stand. In 11 weeks, the United States issued coordinated bilateral demands that would have transferred $340 billion in economic authority to the American Treasury and restructured NATO into a bilateral arrangement centered on Washington. 3 governments signed. 4 more were negotiating. 21 were waiting. Mark Carney placed 14 calls over 6 days, convened no public meetings, characterized no allied government. On Thursday afternoon, he stood at the lectern in Brussels and delivered an address lasting 4 minutes and 41 seconds. At its center were 9 words that have now been read into the record of 14 parliamentary committees. The alliance is not the property of any single member. Within 48 hours, 21 allied heads of government issued public statements confirming the analytical conclusion. The Canadian dollar strengthened 3.1%. The euro strengthened 2.4%. The British pound strengthened 2.1%. The S&P 500 declined 3.7%. American defense contractors lost $74 billion in market capitalization. Goldman Sachs confirmed the institutional realignment. The Business Roundtable broke with the White House. 3 governors publicly opposed administration policy. 7 governments outside NATO requested briefings. 4 sovereign wealth funds reviewed American asset allocations. And Warren Buffett confirmed that NATO had been required to choose between accepting conversion or continuing as a multilateral institution, and that the choice had been articulated by Carney, confirmed by 21 counterparts, and recorded in institutional history as the most consequential realignment since the alliance's original ratification. The alliance is not the property of any single member. Those words have reorganized everything that follows. The geopolitical implications of this moment will unfold across months and years. At Liam Analysis, we track these structural shifts as they develop. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for daily updates on the institutions and decisions shaping our world. Thank you for watching. I'm Liam. This is Liam Analysis.